A 1925 photo shows siblings playing until you realize what's missing. The basement of the Appalachian Heritage Museum in Charleston, West Virginia, smelled of old cardboard and mothballs. It was a cold morning in January 2024, and volunteer archivist James Peterson was sorting through donations from the recently deceased estate of Marion Fletcher, a woman who had lived her entire 97 years in the mountains of southern West Virginia. The collection was typical of rural Appalachian families: handmade quilts, coal mining equipment, church records, and boxes of photographs spanning nearly a century. James had been cataloging these materials for 2 weeks, creating digital records for the museum's expanding database of regional history. He lifted a photograph from a stack marked "Family Photos 1920s" and paused. 4 children stood in front of a modest wooden house, its unpainted planks weathered gray by mountain winters. The children were arranged by height, 2 boys and 2 girls, ranging in age from perhaps 12 down to 6. They wore their Sunday clothes, the older boy in dark trousers and a white shirt with suspenders, the girls in simple cotton dresses with careful patches visible at the hems, the youngest boy in short pants and a shirt that looked slightly too large. What caught James's attention wasn't the children's faces or the humble setting. It was their feet. 3 of the children wore shoes, worn but serviceable leather shoes, carefully laced. But the youngest child, the small boy on the end, stood barefoot on the dirt yard, his pale feet stark against the dark earth. James brought the photograph closer to the window, letting winter light illuminate the details. It wasn't warm weather. The children's long sleeves and the bare trees in the background suggested late fall or early spring. The photograph was dated on the back in faded pencil. November 1925, the Fletcher children. Why would 3 children wear shoes while the 4th went barefoot in November? It couldn't be preference. The boy's posture was careful, slightly rigid, as if he was trying not to show discomfort. His toes curled slightly against the cold ground. James felt something tighten in his chest. After 15 years of archival work, he had developed an instinct for photographs that held stories beyond their surface. This image was speaking to him, but he didn't yet understand what it was saying. He set it aside and continued through the box, but his mind kept returning to those small, bare feet. James couldn't shake the photograph from his thoughts. That evening, he stayed late at the museum, scanning the image in high resolution and examining every detail on his computer screen. The more he looked, the more questions emerged. The children's clothing, while simple and patched, was clean and carefully pressed. Someone had taken pride in their appearance for this photograph. The older boy's hair was neatly combed, the girl's braids were precisely plaited. This was clearly an important occasion. Families in rural Appalachia in 1925 didn't take photographs casually. Film and development were expensive, reserved for significant moments. So why allow the youngest child to appear barefoot? James zoomed in on the boy's face. Unlike his siblings, who looked solemnly at the camera with the studied seriousness common in photographs of that era, the youngest boy had a slight smile. Not a broad grin, but a subtle expression of contentment, almost pride. His chin was lifted, his shoulders back. He didn't look ashamed or uncomfortable. He looked dignified. That detail troubled James most of all. A child forced to go barefoot out of poverty should look embarrassed, diminished. But this boy looked almost defiant in his composure, as if his bare feet were a choice, not a circumstance. James pulled out the estate inventory and began searching for more information about the Fletcher family. Marion Fletcher, the woman whose estate had donated these materials, had been born Marion Fletcher in 1926, the year after this photograph was taken. But the estate records mentioned older siblings. Robert Fletcher, born 1913, Dorothy Fletcher, born 1916, Helen Fletcher, born 1918, and William Fletcher, born 1919. 4 children, the same 4 in the photograph. James did the math. In November 1925, Robert would have been 12, Dorothy 9, Helen 7, and William 6. The ages matched the children in the image perfectly. The barefoot child was William, the youngest. James opened the museum's genealogical database and began tracing the Fletcher family backward. Their father, Thomas Fletcher, had been a coal miner in McDowell County, one of the poorest regions of West Virginia even before the Great Depression. Their mother, Elizabeth, had died in 1924, just 1 year before this photograph was taken. A family of 4 children, recently motherless, living on a coal miner's wages in one of the most economically depressed areas of America. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, though James still didn't fully understand it. He needed to know more about what life was like for families like the Fletchers in 1925. He needed context. The next morning, James drove to the West Virginia State Archives in Charleston, where he spent hours reviewing historical records from McDowell County in the 1920s. What he found painted a grim picture of life in the coal mining communities of southern Appalachia during that period. Coal miners in 1925 earned an average of $3 to $5 per day when they worked, but work was irregular, dependent on demand and mine operations. Miners were paid by the ton of coal extracted, not by the hour, and a single day's injury or illness meant no income. Most miners worked for companies that owned not just the mines but also the houses workers lived in and the stores where they bought their goods, creating a system of perpetual debt that kept families trapped in poverty. James found mortality records showing that McDowell County had one of the highest death rates in the nation. Black lung disease, mining accidents, influenza, tuberculosis, and childhood illnesses devastated families. The records confirmed that Elizabeth Fletcher had died of pneumonia in March 1924, leaving Thomas Fletcher alone with 4 children aged 11, 8, 6, and 5. Children's clothing and shoes were expensive luxuries. James found advertisements from 1925 Charleston newspapers. A pair of children's leather shoes cost between $2 and $3, nearly a full day's wages for a coal miner. For a family of 4 children with growing feet, keeping everyone shod was nearly impossible. Many families in rural Appalachia made difficult choices. Children often went barefoot, except in the coldest winter months. Hand-me-down shoes were treasured, repaired repeatedly until they literally fell apart. Some families prioritized shoes for the children who attended school most regularly, or for those whose health was most fragile. But the photograph bothered James precisely because 3 children had shoes. If the family truly couldn't afford 4 pairs, wouldn't it make more sense for all the children to go barefoot, or for them to share shoes, alternating who wore them for special occasions? There was something deliberate about this arrangement, something intentional. James photographed the relevant historical documents and returned to the museum, more determined than ever to understand the story behind those bare feet. Back at the museum, James continued sorting through Marion Fletcher's estate materials. In a box marked personal papers, he found a manila envelope containing letters dating from the 1940s through the 1980s. Most were correspondence between Marion and her siblings after they had grown and scattered to different cities for work. One letter, however, stood out. It was dated December 1975, written by William Fletcher, the barefoot boy from the photograph, to his sister Marion. The handwriting was shaky. William would have been in his 50s when he wrote it, but the letter mentioned recent hospitalization and declining health. James read it carefully. "Dear Marion, thank you for the photograph you sent from 1925. I hadn't seen it in 50 years, didn't even know a copy still existed. Looking at it brings back so many memories, some painful, but mostly good ones. You asked me about my feet in that picture, why I was the only one barefoot. I'm glad you asked. It's a story I've wanted to tell for a long time, but somehow never found the right moment. After Mama died in 1924, things got very hard. You were too young to remember, you weren't even born yet. But those months were the darkest of our childhood. Papa was lost in his grief, working double shifts at the mine when he could get them, trying to keep us fed and housed. Robert, Dorothy, Helen, and I did what we could. We were just children, but we understood that everything had changed. That fall, Papa came home one evening and said we were going to have our photograph taken. A traveling photographer was coming through the county, and Papa had saved up enough money to pay for one portrait. He said it was important, that we needed to have something to show we were still a family, still together, still standing despite everything we'd lost. But there was a problem. We only had 3 pairs of shoes among the 4 of us, and all of them were in rough shape. Papa had been patching them as best he could, but children's feet grow fast and we'd all outgrown what we had. He told us he'd try to buy another pair before the photograph, but when the day came, there just wasn't money. I remember sitting in our kitchen that morning, the four of us, trying to decide what to do. Robert said maybe we should all go barefoot, that it would be more honest that way. Dorothy suggested we take turns wearing the shoes, switching partway through if the photographer would allow it. Helen said maybe we should cancel the photograph entirely, but I had another idea. James set down the letter, his heart pounding. He took a breath and continued reading. William's letter continued. I told them I would go barefoot. I was the youngest, I said, and the smallest. I could stand the cold better than they could. But that wasn't the real reason, and I think they knew it. The real reason was that I wanted my siblings to look their best. Robert was 12, almost a young man. He'd taken on so much responsibility after Mama died, helping Papa in ways a child shouldn't have to, making sure Dorothy, Helen, and I were fed and cared for. He deserved to look dignified in that photograph. Dorothy and Helen had been wearing the same two dresses for over a year, carefully mended and let out as they grew. I wanted them to at least have proper shoes, to look like the young ladies they were becoming despite our circumstances. And honestly, Marion, I was proud to do it. 6 years old, and I felt like I was contributing something important, like I was helping our family maintain its dignity, even when we had so little. They argued with me at first. Dorothy cried and said it wasn't fair. Robert tried to insist that as the oldest, he should be the one to sacrifice, but I wouldn't budge. I remember Papa watching us from the doorway, not saying anything, just listening to his children try to take care of each other. Finally, he came over and knelt down in front of me. He looked me in the eyes and asked, "William, are you sure? It's going to be cold. People might think poorly of us." I told him I was sure, and I meant it. When we took that photograph standing in front of our house on that cold November morning, I wasn't thinking about my bare feet. I was thinking about how proud I was of my family, how good my siblings looked, how we were going to have this picture to prove we hadn't been broken by loss. The photographer, I remember his name was Mr. Caldwell. He noticed, of course. He asked Papa quietly if he wanted to delay the photograph, maybe wait until we had 4 pairs of shoes. But Papa looked at me, and I shook my head. We'd already waited so long. We needed this picture, so Mr. Caldwell took the photograph. And you know what I remember most clearly? Not the cold ground under my feet, not any shame or embarrassment. I remember standing there next to Robert, Dorothy, and Helen, feeling like I was exactly where I belonged. Like those bare feet were my contribution to our family's survival, my way of saying, we're going to be all right. And that photograph has meant more to me over the years than any possession I've ever owned. It reminds me that even in our darkest times, we took care of each other. That we had pride and dignity even when we had nothing else. That love sometimes means standing barefoot in November so your sister can wear shoes. James set down the letter, tears streaming down his face. He looked again at the photograph on his computer screen, at William's slight smile, his lifted chin, his careful posture. Now he understood. This wasn't a photograph of poverty. It was a photograph of love. James spent the next several days researching what had become of the Fletcher children. The letter from William had opened a door into their family history, and he was determined to understand the full arc of their lives. Robert Fletcher, the oldest boy in the photograph, had followed his father into the coal mines at age 14, leaving school to help support his siblings. He'd worked underground for 43 years, retiring in 1970 with severe black lung disease. But during those decades, he'd helped pay for his younger siblings' educations, ensuring they had opportunities he'd never had. He died in 1978 at age 65, survived by 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Dorothy Fletcher had become a school teacher, one of the first in her family to attend college. She'd graduated from Concord College in 1937 with a degree in elementary education and spent 35 years teaching in one-room schoolhouses across McDowell County. Her obituary from 1989 mentioned that she'd taught over 1,000 children, many from families as poor as her own had been. Helen Fletcher had married at 19 and moved to Ohio, where her husband found factory work during World War II. She'd raised 5 children and worked as a seamstress, sending money home to West Virginia whenever she could. She died in 1995 at age 77. William Fletcher, the barefoot boy, had served in World War II, been wounded at the Battle of the Bulge, and returned home to West Virginia in 1946. He'd worked as a carpenter and later as a maintenance supervisor at a public school. He'd married, had 2 daughters, and lived quietly until his death in 1982 at age 63. Marion, the youngest sibling born after the photograph was taken, had been the one who preserved the family's history. She'd collected photographs, letters, and documents throughout her long life, creating an archive that now sat in boxes at the museum where James worked. What struck James most as he traced these lives was how the siblings had remained connected across the decades. They'd written letters constantly, visited when they could afford it, supported each other through hardships. The bonds formed in that difficult childhood had never broken. In Marion's papers, James found references to annual family reunions held every summer from the 1950s until the last sibling died. Dozens of photographs showed the family gathering in various locations, parks, backyards, church halls, their numbers growing as children became parents and then grandparents. In one photograph from 1970, James recognized the 4 siblings from the 1925 image, now in late middle age. They stood in the same order: Robert, Dorothy, Helen, William, their arms around each other. And there, visible if you looked closely, William was wearing expensive leather shoes, polished to a shine. James smiled through his tears. As James prepared to write an article about the Fletcher family photograph for the museum's quarterly publication, he began noticing similar details in other photographs from the Appalachian region during the 1920s and 1930s. In an image from eastern Kentucky dated 1927, 5 children posed together, 4 with shoes and 1 barefoot. In a Tennessee photograph from 1930, a family of 6 children showed 3 wearing shoes and 3 without. Sometimes it was the youngest who went barefoot, sometimes it was the oldest, but the pattern repeated across dozens of images from the poorest regions of Appalachia. James reached out to colleagues at other regional museums and historical societies, asking if they'd noticed similar patterns. Dr. Sarah Blackburn, director of the Museum of Rural Appalachian Life in North Carolina, responded immediately. "I've been documenting this for years," she told James during a phone call. "These photographs are all over our collections. Families making impossible choices about limited resources, but doing it with such care and dignity. I've interviewed descendants who told me stories similar to William Fletcher's, children volunteering to go without shoes so siblings could look proper, siblings negotiating among themselves about who most needed what." Sarah sent James copies of oral history interviews she'd conducted in the 1990s with people who'd grown up during the Depression. Many remembered the shame of not having shoes, but others remembered it differently, as a form of contribution, of helping their families survive. One interview particularly moved James. A woman named Ruth Hensley, born in 1918, had been interviewed at age 78. "We took a family photograph in 1929, right before the stock market crash made everything even worse than it already was. My little brother Johnny insisted he'd go barefoot, so my sister and I could wear the only 2 pairs of shoes we had. He was 7 years old, standing in the cold dirt, and he looked so proud, like he was a soldier going to battle." Mama cried after the photographer left, but Johnny told her not to worry. He said, "Mama, when people look at this picture someday, they'll see that we were a family that took care of each other. That's worth more than shoes." James realized he was looking at more than individual family stories. This was a cultural pattern, a form of sacrifice and solidarity that had helped families survive the worst economic conditions in American history. These barefoot children weren't victims to be pitied. They were participants in their family's survival, making choices that preserved dignity and demonstrated love in the face of devastating poverty. James published his article about the Fletcher family photograph in the museum's Spring 2024 newsletter. He'd titled it, "The Barefoot Boy, Sacrifice and Dignity in Depression-Era Appalachia," and included both the original 1925 photograph and excerpts from William Fletcher's letter to his sister Marion. 3 weeks after publication, James received an email from a woman named Jennifer Hayes in Richmond, Virginia. The subject line read, "William Fletcher was my grandfather." James's hands trembled as he opened the message. "Dear Mr. Peterson, I just read your article about my grandfather William Fletcher and his siblings. I am Jennifer Hayes, née Fletcher, the younger daughter of William and Martha Fletcher. My grandfather died when I was only 7 years old, so I never got to hear most of his stories firsthand. But my father has told me bits and pieces over the years, and your article brought them all together in a way that made me weep. I have something you might want to see." When my grandfather died in 1982, my father inherited his personal effects. Among them was a small wooden box that Grandpa William kept on his dresser. Inside was the original print of the 1925 photograph you wrote about, along with a pair of children's shoes, small, worn leather shoes that I always assumed were some kind of family heirloom. After reading your article, I called my father and asked him about those shoes. He told me a story I'd never heard before. In 1970, when Grandpa William's health was already failing, he took my father to a shoemaker in Charleston. He had the man make a pair of children's shoes exactly like the ones his siblings had worn in the 1925 photograph. The shoes he'd gone without so they could look proper. The shoemaker thought it was a strange request, but Grandpa William insisted on getting every detail right: the leather, the laces, the style. When the shoes were finished, Grandpa William brought them home and placed them in that wooden box along with the photograph. My father asked him why he'd done it, and Grandpa William said, "Because I want to remember that going without those shoes was the proudest choice I ever made. I want to remember that love sometimes looks like sacrifice, and that dignity isn't about what you have, it's about what you're willing to give. Would you like to see those shoes? I think they belong in your museum," alongside the photograph in Grandpa William's story. James immediately responded, and 2 weeks later, Jennifer drove to Charleston with the wooden box. When she opened it in his office, James found himself looking at a perfect replica of 1925 children's shoes, never worn, carefully preserved for 54 years. But there was something else in the box. A small envelope containing a handwritten note from William Fletcher, dated 1970. "To whoever finds these shoes represent the ones I didn't wear in November 1925. I was 6 years old and barefoot, and I thought I was just helping my family look good for a photograph. But that choice taught me something that shaped the rest of my life, that the greatest gift you can give is to let someone else have what you need. That real wealth isn't measured in possessions but in the willingness to do without, so others can have more. I've tried to live by that principle ever since. These shoes are a reminder. May they remind you too." William Fletcher. 6 months after his initial discovery, James curated a special exhibition at the Appalachian Heritage Museum titled, "What's Missing? Stories of Sacrifice in Depression-Era Appalachia." The centerpiece was the Fletcher family photograph displayed alongside William's letter, the replica shoes, and the wooden box that had preserved them. But James had expanded the exhibition to include dozens of similar photographs from across the region, each showing families making difficult choices about limited resources. He'd tracked down descendants, collected oral histories, and pieced together the human stories behind the images. One section focused on clothing, photographs showing children in mismatched outfits, 2 large hand-me-downs, carefully patched dresses. Another examined food, displaying images of Depression-era meals and family gardens. A third section highlighted education, showing photographs of one-room schoolhouses and children who'd left school early to work. But the core of the exhibition was about the choices families made and the dignity they maintained. James had interviewed over 40 descendants of families whose photographs appeared in the collection. Their stories revealed a common thread. In the face of devastating poverty, Appalachian families had created systems of mutual support, sacrifice, and solidarity that allowed them to survive. The exhibition opened in October 2024, and the response was overwhelming. News coverage spread across West Virginia and neighboring states. Hundreds of people contacted the museum with their own family photographs and stories, expanding the collection far beyond what James had initially compiled. Many visitors came specifically to see the Fletcher photograph and William's shoes. James watched them stand in front of the display, reading the story, examining the images, and inevitably wiping away tears. The exhibition touched something deep, a recognition that the values William had embodied were desperately needed in the modern world. One afternoon, James noticed an elderly man standing alone in front of the Fletcher display, staring at the photograph with intense concentration. James approached quietly. "Can I help you with anything, sir?" The man turned, his eyes wet. "That could be my family. We took a photograph just like this one in 1928, up in Logan County. My sister went without shoes so the rest of us could wear them. I haven't thought about it in decades, but seeing this, it all came back." "What was your sister's name?" James asked gently. Betty Carson. She died in 1995, but she was the strongest person I ever knew. 6 years old, standing barefoot in the cold, and she never complained once. She just wanted the rest of us to look nice." James pulled out his notebook. "Would you be willing to tell me her story?" The man nodded. And for the next hour, James listened as another thread was added to the tapestry of sacrifice, love, and dignity that these photographs represented. A year after James first discovered the Fletcher family photograph, he stood in the museum's expanded exhibition space, which now occupied an entire floor. The collection had grown to include over 300 photographs from Depression-era Appalachia, each accompanied by stories of the families who'd survived those difficult years. The Fletcher photograph remained the centerpiece, but it was no longer alone. Surrounding it were images of other children who'd made similar sacrifices. A boy who'd gone without a winter coat so his sisters could have warm clothing, a girl who'd shared one pair of glasses with 3 siblings, a family of 7 children who'd rotated their single pair of boots throughout the winter. But the exhibition had evolved beyond simply documenting hardship. James had worked with educators to create programming that connected these historical stories to contemporary issues of poverty, inequality, and community resilience. School groups toured the exhibition regularly, and students were asked to think about what these photographs could teach them about their own lives. One display featured modern photographs alongside the historical ones, contemporary families from Appalachia sharing their own stories of making difficult choices with limited resources. The economic struggles that had shaped the Fletcher family's life in 1925 hadn't disappeared. They'd simply evolved. But so had the strategies for survival and the commitment to maintaining dignity in the face of hardship. Jennifer Hayes, William Fletcher's granddaughter, had become a regular volunteer at the museum, sharing her grandfather's story with visitors and collecting additional oral histories from the region. She'd discovered dozens of cousins she'd never known existed, descendants of Robert, Dorothy, Helen, and Marion Fletcher, all eager to contribute to the preservation of their family's history. Together, they'd created a family archive that went far beyond the 1925 photograph. They'd collected letters, documents, and photographs spanning nearly a century, showing how the values embodied in that single image, sacrifice, solidarity, dignity, had been passed down through generations. On a crisp November afternoon in 2025, exactly 100 years after the Fletcher photograph was taken, the museum held a special commemoration. Over 50 descendants of the Fletcher family gathered, along with descendants of other families featured in the exhibition. They stood together for a group photograph on the museum steps, a century removed from the hardships their ancestors had endured, but connected by the same values. James stood back and watched as the photographer arranged the group. He thought about William Fletcher, standing barefoot in the cold at age 6, making a choice that would echo through the decades. He thought about how that single act of love had rippled forward through time, shaping not just his own family but now inspiring thousands of people who'd seen the photograph and learned its story. Later that evening, after the crowds had departed, James returned to the exhibition alone. He stood in front of the Fletcher photograph, looking once again at those small bare feet that had started this entire journey. For 100 years, people had looked at this image and seen poverty. They'd seen hardship, deprivation, the cruel inequalities of Depression-era America. And while all of that was true, it was incomplete. What they'd missed, what James now understood with perfect clarity, was that this photograph showed the opposite of poverty. It showed wealth of a kind that couldn't be measured in dollars or shoes, the wealth of a family that loved each other enough to sacrifice, that maintained dignity in the face of crushing hardship, that refused to be broken by loss. William Fletcher's bare feet weren't a sign of what his family lacked. They were a testament to what they possessed in abundance: courage, love, and an unshakable commitment to each other's well-being. The photograph would outlast them all, just as it already had. But now, instead of being overlooked or pitied, it would be recognized for what it truly was: a monument to the extraordinary grace ordinary people can display in the most difficult circumstances. James thought about William's note. The greatest gift you can give is to let someone else have what you need. In an era of abundance and inequality, of having so much while others had so little, that message felt more urgent than ever. The Barefoot Boy from 1925 had something to teach the world of 2025 and all the years to come. The photograph remained frozen in time, but its truth was alive, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that what we choose to do without can matter as much as what we possess, and that love measured in sacrifice leaves the most enduring legacy.